Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions today, please type them into the Q&A icon located at the bottom toolbar, and we'll answer them at the end of each presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the August 23rd edition of Crop Talk. And with this year's harvest being a little bit on the early side so far, I guess I shouldn't jinx it, because we've been getting a little bit of rain and a lot of fog and wet conditions in the last couple of days here. So hopefully things will smarten up and we'll be able to get back in the field. But we are about talking to a lot of producers anywhere from a week to maybe 2 weeks earlier than normal. I thought it would be a good idea maybe to talk a little bit about some fall seeded crops. As things are looking right now, we might have the chance to maybe get in the field and have an opportunity actually this year to maybe select fields that would maybe work better for winter crops, besides just sowing the first field we get off, if we're one of those people that one of those producers that plant winter wheat or fall rye every year. So this year we might have some options and some field selection ability. So gave Anna a call and was wondering if she could maybe give us an update on winter wheat and things to do, and maybe some varieties and some just some do's to get the crop off to a good start. So we'll start with that, and then we're going to head into our crop scouting panel, and we've had a few questions come in. So I guess from there we will pass it over to Anne, and you can take her away.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. I'll just share my screen here. Oops. Okay, just a moment here. Okay, can you see my screen?
You bet.
Okay, great. I'll get started. So yeah, as Lionel said, I'm going to talk a bit about winter cereal production. So just a bit of an overview in terms of acreage the last 20 or so years. So we do see that winter wheat does fluctuate over time, and it has been, the last 7 years or so, it has been decreasing. And we do see some amount of increasing of fall rye acreage. And that's likely because of some of the newer varieties and some of the hybrid fall rye varieties that are available now. Just for some context for winter wheat, this is prairie winter wheat acreage for all three prairie provinces, from the late 70s to 2021. So while we are in a dip, winter wheat acreage has increased and bounced back again from some lower years. So yeah, we may see some increase, or hopefully we'll see some bounce back in winter wheat acreage over time. So in terms of planting considerations, I just wanted to go over things like variety selection, seeding date and rates, fertilizer application, and a bit on weed control. So the seed guide is the best good source of information on winter cereal varieties. We are just analyzing the data for the 2023 winter wheat and fall rye trials, and hopefully that information will be out early next week. But it is a bit of a rush to get those trials off the field and have the data analyzed and out to farmers before seeding. So hopefully we'll have some new information, but information that's in the seed guide does cover the list of varieties that are available to farmers right now. So in the last few years, last year, the top varieties were Emerson, Wildfire, Gateway, and Network. Wildfire, Network, Cold Front, and Vortex, those are all newer varieties from Rob Graff's breeding program that all have good potential in terms of, pretty high yielding and fairly good disease packages. So yeah, Vortex and Wildfire are both MR in terms of fusarium head blight. So I encourage people to take a look at the seed guide for winter wheat varieties. And fall rye as well. So we do list varieties by hybrids and open pollinated. So we have seen much more interest in open pollinated fall rye varieties, which do require a bit of different management. And we're looking at about 20 bushel per acre yield difference between those hybrids and the open pollinated, but it kind of really depends on your growing conditions and your management practices. So this is from the McBeth trials, where we do treat them pretty much the same in terms of nitrogen application and management. So in terms of open pollinated and hybrid acreage, I just have it listed from 2022 to 2019. So we have seen 2022 was the first year where we did see more open pollinated fall rye varieties being planted than hybrids. And I think that's just a reflection of the varieties that are available to farmers and all of the newer European varieties that are coming in that have good yield potential. So in terms of field selection this year, as Lionel mentioned, is a much better year to be planting and planting winter cereal varieties than last year. Last year, the big issue with some late seeding was that there just wasn't stubble available for seeding. It was tough for some farmers to find canola stubble or other stubble that was ready in time for winter cereal planting. So we always want people to plant into stubble to reduce the risk of winter kill. And if canola stubble isn't available, so canola stubble would be the good first choice. But research has shown that barley and pea stubble are also good alternatives. So if canola stubble isn't available, there are good alternatives. And in a multi-year prairie research study, the researchers didn't find a difference in terms of yield and establishment between canola, barley, and pea. Canola was the best, but there wasn't a significant difference between barley and pea stubble as well. So to optimize winter survival, we want the stubble to hold 4 inches or more of snow, which helps protect the temperatures from dropping into lethal temperatures for the winter cereal crown. It also is good to mention that insurance coverage is dependent on seeding into eligible stubble types. So it's good to check into that before seeding into, say a tilled field or a different type of stubble, to just make sure that insurance will cover that. And when we look at the snow trapping potential, we want to look at stubble height, stems per meter a row, and stubble rows per meter squared. So not only just how tall that stubble is, but how much of that stubble is remaining after harvesting, harrowing, and all the traffic on the field that comes with harvest time. So seeding dates, the mask coverage has changed in the last few years. So the deadline for winter cereals, seeding dates range from August 15th to September 25th, and extended coverage with September 26th to 30th. That said, for fall rye, we basically encourage people to plant between August 25th and September 25th. And for winter wheat, ideally August 25th to September 15th. So the reason why we encourage people to seed on the earlier side is because the seedling needs to have adequate time to develop healthy crowns and at least 2 to 3 leaves going into winter. So if we haven't established, a well-developed crown in those leaves, there is a higher risk of winter kill. Soil moisture can be a bit of a concern in the fall time, especially after we've had a dry summer and the crop has used a lot of the soil moisture. But we really, the temperature in the fall and the amount of time do have a greater influence on establishment in soil moisture, because that winter wheat can establish on very low soil moisture levels. And we do encourage people to seed on the optimum date regardless of soil moisture conditions. So the slide I'm showing here is from the research study that Yvonne Lawley conducted at the U of M and across Saskatchewan and Alberta as well, looking at the effect of seeding date on winter wheat. So this is the research that was conducted in order to push back those mask seeding date deadlines. So from this study, there's a lot going on in this graph, but we have maximum yield on the y-axis and fall growing degree days on the x-axis. So in the middle, we have yield at the ideal planting, and then to the left with late planting and the right with early planting. So we also see that that with early planting, With earlier planting, we had about 80% of maximum yield. And with that ideal, and even going to late planting, we had about 95% of maximum yield. So this study showed that winter wheat could be planted into October and even early November at most sites in most years. And in Manitoba, planting before September 1st reduced winter wheat yield. So I did have a few calls last week and the week before from farmers and agronomists saying that they had, a field that they wanted to plant winter wheat into was ready for seeding because of an early harvest, and if it was too early to seed. And I definitely would say yes, that we should stick to that August 25th as kind of your earlier range for winter wheat seeding. So yeah, as Yvonne's research showed, with early planting, we did see a yield reduction, and that's because seeding too early allows the crown to get too big before freeze up, and then it means it's more susceptible to freezing injury over the winter. Rye is a bit of a different story. There hasn't been a lot of fall rye studies with seeding date. This was one that was conducted in Saskatchewan, showing that the ideal fall rye seeding time ranged from that like late August to mid-September. And I don't think that there's as much of a risk of winter kill with early seeding, but studies have shown that with early seeding, you'd have lower thousand kernel weight and lower thousand kernel weight and lower yields with early seeding and later seeding. So for seeding depth, for both crops, we would recommend about 1 inch. So deeper seeding can result in decreased emergence and weak plants, which can cause severe winter kill. So yeah, if you have deep seeding, you have kind of more spindly plants, poor weed competition, later maturity, and lower yield. So while soil moisture from the previous crop usually has a fairly dry seedbed, seeding deeper doesn't necessarily get the seed into moisture, and we would never recommend that because you would have more of like a spindly plant that's more susceptible to winter kill. And we know that as little as about 1/3 of an inch of rain is often enough to establish winter wheat. So we don't need as much rain for germination and emergence in the fall as we do in the spring. This is because the soils are cooler, we have less evaporation on the surface, and so those light rains can really soak into the soil and be accessed by the seed. And that deep seeding does mean that the plant has to expend more energy to move the crown up to the appropriate level in the soil. For seeding rates, this is where we start getting a bit into some differences between hybrids and open pollinated for fall rye. So for winter wheat, I think we should be aiming for a plant population. The range is about 20 to 30 plants per square feet. I'd recommend aiming for about 30 plants per square feet for a final plant stand. So recent research by Brian Bears in Alberta, he did a study across the Canadian prairies, found that producers should plant about 450 seeds per meter squared, which when you account for germination and mortality, that equaled to be about 30 seeds per square foot. So for fall rye, we know that fall rye has a very good ability to tiller, so seeding rates are a bit lower. So hybrids are sold in units, not in bushels. So hybrid fall rye, the recommended seeding rate is 1 unit per acre, and 1 unit is 1 million viable seeds. So that ends up being that if you're planting 1 million seeds per acre, you're planting about 23 plants per square foot. And for open pollinated, the target plant population would be 24 plants per square foot. So hybrids are seeded a bit lower because they do have a very good ability to tiller. In the winter wheat stand density research, or the stand density recommendation did come from research conducted across the prairies in the 90s, where they did find no significant difference in yields between a final plant stand of about 20 to 30 plants per square foot. So seed treatments are definitely recommended for winter wheat. There was a big study, this is part of the seeding rate study that Brian Bears conducted on 26 sites across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So they compared sowing densities of 200 and 400 seeds per meter squared. With the lower seeding rates, we definitely recommended, sorry, I have some children with me in the office today, unfortunately. So with the lower seeding rate, they definitely recommended we had better net returns and better yields with a fungicide and insecticide. With the higher seeding rate, it wasn't as necessary, but it would still be recommended. And in Yvonne's Lawley's study on winter wheat, when yields average across all sites were higher when planted with a seed treatment in 2 out of 3 years of the study. So based on those research projects, we would recommend a seed treatment. So moving on to soil fertility. Soil fertility can be a bit tricky for fall crop because there are a few different options in terms of when you can apply. So the 3 methods would be applying all of your fall in the spring, which was traditionally the more common option, applying all of your nitrogen in the fall, or doing a split between fall and spring. So in wetter climates like Manitoba, the standard was to apply all of the fertilizer for fall cereals in the spring. And this was just because if we applied it in the fall, we saw too many losses from volatilization and leaching. In drier areas like in Alberta, the standard was to apply it all in the fall, because if you applied in the spring, there's a good chance that fertilizer wouldn't make its way down to the root for the plant to uptake it. But based on more, and so that's why some people have moved to a system where you're doing a split application. So some of the fall risks are we can have excessive top growth, which can reduce winter hardiness. And research has shown that seed place phosphorus is very effective at counteracting this lack of winter hardiness because having phosphorus with the seed improves establishment in the fall and encourages recovery from winter injury. There's also the risk of leaching and denitrification, but that can be mitigated by having some sort of coated nitrogen product. And the spring risks that I mentioned are that we can have stranding at the surface in a dry spring, or if we have a wet spring, it can be tough to get on the field in an appropriate time, and then nitrogen could be applied later than ideal. So there has been some more recent research, also conducted by Brian Bears. We're looking at nitrogen sources and timing. So, so the results of this research would be, although it's conducted on winter wheat, would also be very appropriate and useful for fall rye growers as well. So across all sites, fall application at seeding in a sideband can perform very well to the traditional spring broadcast of nitrogen. So they also looked at both timing and products. So this research also shows that a slow release product such as ESN was not appropriate for spring application when the wheat needed readily available access to nitrogen. So in Manitoba, where we typically have moisture conditions, a split application would be maybe most prudent in terms of mitigating risks from both spring and fall application. So the bottom row here shows half sideband at the time of seeding and half spring broadcast. And they didn't see a significant difference in terms of yields between the half and half for the urea, agrotine, and super U products versus all at seeding or all in the spring. Oops. So they did do a second study where they looked at various split timings to see how early a split application of nitrogen needed to be applied. And this is a very busy graph, but it's basically just showing that in a delayed springtime, if you have to apply nitrogen late in the spring due to wet soil conditions, this was just as effective as applying early, as long as half of the N was sidebanded at the time of seeding. So just showing that doing the 50% or a 60-40 split can mitigate some of those risks. And they did see lower yields in the least protein when half of the nitrogen was applied as a late fall broadcast. And this just suggests that those surface fall treatments are subject to higher losses. So if people are applying nitrogen in the fall, it is recommended that it is sidebanded to reduce those fall losses. So I'll just briefly touch on weed management. So for annual weeds, winter cereals are good a good crop to perhaps reduce herbicide costs. So if you do have a dense stand, winter cereals, you can have very good weed competition, especially against those annual weeds that are emerging in the spring. In many cases, the winter cereals have a good competitive stand by the time those annuals would be emerging. So it's a good time to choke out some of those weeds. But winter annuals and perennial weeds can be a challenge in winter wheat and fall rye. So some of those winter annual weeds like stinkweeds, shepherd's purse, bromes can be fairly challenging, just because there isn't a good. It's difficult to control those winter annuals in the spring in your winter wheat crop. So there are some various opportunities for herbicide application. So pre-seed or pre-emergence, fall in crop, or spring in crop. So pre-seeding and pre-emergence is an effective way to control problem perennial and winter annual weeds and set the crop up for a successful stand establishment. And if those winter annual weeds are an issue but weren't controlled prior to emergence, then the most effective time for control would be in the fall prior to freezing. So since these weeds resume growth very early in the spring, it is difficult to control them in the spring, and it's best to control them in the previous fall at the time of seeding. So in terms of herbicide options, I would just recommend looking at the Guide to Crop Protection for some of those options, and just knowing what weeds are going to be a problem in your field can be a big help in terms of controlling them. I just wanted to end off that Manitoba Crop Alliance is conducting some on-farm winter wheat trials. So I definitely encourage any farmers or agronomists that know of farmers that might be interested to contact Jordan Karpinchik or Daryl Rex with Manitoba Crop Alliance to see if they can participate in these studies. I know they're always looking for farmers that would like to participate. So one is looking at application timing of nitrogen fertilizer in winter wheat. So this study is going to be comparing all of your nitrogen applied in the fall, all of it applied in the spring, and then a split. And then also looking at winter wheat seeding rates is the second study. So it'll be great to have more information from some of these on-farm trials. And the application timing of nitrogen fertilizer study will be a good companion to the Ducks Unlimited project that's been going on for a couple of years, looking at nitrogen application timing in winter wheat. And it's always great to have both some of that on-farm trials and the smaller plot trials to show some of those results. So that's all I have, and I'll turn it back to you, Lionel.
Okay, maybe just leave your screen up there, and I got a few questions for you. Going back to fall rye, and when you had, I guess, the seed guide up there, can you maybe just explain the falling number on the guide there as to pretty big variance in numbers there? So the question came up as what falling number is a good falling number, or what should you be targeting?
Sure, and so the falling number results that we have up on the seed guide, I should also mention, do come from registration trials. So at the time of registration, that the submitter has to submit a bunch of both quality, disease, and yield information. So that the falling number isn't from we haven't conducted those tests, but it is from the registration trials. So yeah, there is a big variance. I would be semi-cautious about the Hazlitt variety. Does show you want a higher falling number. Higher is better in terms of falling numbers. And the falling number test is conducted by making a slurry out of the grain and then looking to see how fast a plunger moves through that slurry in seconds. And it's basically measuring alpha amylase content in the seed, or alpha amylase content in the grain, which is needed for baking. So we want to have more alpha amylase in the grain, and if the falling number is lower, it means that the process of sprouting and germination has started in the seed. So it's kind of a measure of pre-harvest sprouting. So we do want a higher falling number, usually above 250 is what we'd be targeting. But yeah, in general, higher is better.
Okay, and just a follow-up to that, does weather affect the falling number?
Yeah, for sure. So if we have ripe, mature grain in the field that's being unable to be harvested, and weather is kind of like a day like today where it's a little bit misty and damp, or the crop gets a rain on it, then we would be concerned that we'd be having some sort of, even if you can't see it, like even if there's no visible sprouting in the grain, the process of germination can be starting with that damper weather, and basically be eating up that alpha amylase in the grain and resulting in a lower falling number score.
Okay, and then while we're still on the seed guide, the question regarding protein levels in winter wheat, are they very important?
Yeah, I guess it really depends on the market. So yeah, it really just depends what farmers are targeting for market. So obviously, like a milling market would require higher protein levels, and often in like the milling, they do mix winter wheat in with the spring wheat varieties, so especially the Canadian Western Red Winter. So yeah, protein levels. Winter wheat generally does have lower protein levels than spring wheat, and I'm not really 100% sure what the millers are targeting for winter wheat, but they'd be expecting lower protein levels because that's just the potential of the winter wheat varieties.
Okay. Yes, this one is probably more from some of the stuff we've seen in previous years, but does wheat need to emerge to survive the winter?
No, not necessarily. So there has, like, people do dormant seed winter cereals. So you're talking, I'm guessing, about like a dormant seeding situation where someone's seeding fairly late?
Well, that, and I guess probably the fact that in case of right now we're looking at some dry conditions, I guess, so that, we had talked about, you had mentioned about not seeding too deep. So I
Right.
guess the question might mean if we don't get rain and it doesn't germinate, is it still gonna, or will it germinate and not come through the ground? I guess, is it gonna survive?
Yeah, that's it. So like there has been some good success with dormant seeding and with wheat that hasn't emerged from the ground before freeze up. So like obviously we would never, that's not ideal. And it would have to be assessed for plant stand in the spring. But if you are in a situation where you seed winter wheat at, in an appropriate time, we don't get rain and it doesn't come up, I wouldn't necessarily just write it off. I would wait till spring to assess it, because I've heard lots of instances where the winter wheat does end up being a fairly good stand across the field and yields okay. So yeah, I wouldn't write it off, that's for sure.
Okay, and then one question regarding fertilizer. How late can we go in the spring with our second application or first application regarding, I guess, leaf staging?
Sure. So we definitely, we always recommend getting it on as early as possible because the wheat does have fairly high nitrogen needs early on in the growing season. But this study was looking, that I pulled up here, the top sort of section shows yield. And they actually did see, this was a study that took place like across the Canadian prairies. So they looked at later spring broadcasts. So we have stem elongation, swollen boot, and stem elongation, the start of booting, and swollen boot. And really, there wasn't a big difference in terms of yield. I don't think there was no significant difference in most cases in terms of yield. And we actually did see some very good yields with the swollen boot stage. So, well, earlier is best. If you can't get it on early, it's still good to come in later and apply it because it can still result. You wouldn't expect a huge difference in yield as long as half of that fertilizer was on in the fall. So that's really why we would encourage people to do the 50-50 split, because then you'd have less risk in the spring of if you do get on late, at least there is a lot of nitrogen available for the plant to start growing.
Okay, and a comment that came in, if you're using barley stubble, be sure to use a 2-row barley stubble since volunteers are more of an issue with 6-row varieties.
Okay.
And just wondering if you had any comments regarding that. I'm thinking that probably with 6-row, with 2-row, if there's any throwing over or left in the field, that a lot of that will probably germinate in the fall as compared to maybe some of the 6-row, or
Yeah, that may be the case. I'm not really sure, yeah, on the volunteer issue, but that is a good point. So, like, that's why we would recommend canola is definitely the best first choice. I would recommend canola just in terms of, you know, having less of a volunteer issue and also just having that sturdier, thicker stems. But if canola isn't an option, you know, yeah, barley could be an option as well as some other stubble types as well. Yeah, the volunteer issue is definitely something to keep in mind.
okay, good. You're going to hang on, Anne. So that's all the questions I have right now. And one more slide I put together here. You had mentioned the Ducks Unlimited, and they do have a program. And the best thing here would be to get a hold of Alex Griffiths from Ducks Unlimited. There's his contact information, but they do have a program too, I think, for first-time growers for I think it's $20 an acre up to a maximum of 5,000 to help you with some of your costs, and then some soil sampling and some support from the DU specialists as well. So again, something to check in if you're looking at growing winter wheat. I think their program is for but yeah, that's the only other thing that I would have to add right now for winter wheat and fall rye. Thanks for that, Anne. And right now we'll get into our crop scouting panel. And first question is for Dennis Lang. I'm not hoping Dennis is on, but soybeans are turning, which is earlier than last year, and this was from a producer in some of the drier areas. And he was wondering if it's because of lack of moisture, or is it because of our growing season, because we've had maybe more growing degree days up to date, and it's just their time to start shutting down. So Dennis, hopefully you got some comments on that.
Yes, Lionel. Yeah, I just want to check to make sure you can hear me okay.
You bet.
Okay. So yeah, there is a combination of a few things, I guess. Number one, the drier conditions that we've been seeing this year will hasten maturity. We're starting to see that in some regions, even in the central region here, where the plants are just kind of running out of moisture, so they're prematurely finishing off. We also have had, you know, some warmer temperatures, and we're ahead of as far as growing degree days. So things have moved up quickly as well. Now, it's interesting, when I was traveling yesterday, within a span of about 5 miles, you go from varieties that look like this, where leaves are all dropping, to a variety that's, you know, still pretty green yet, right in that R6 stage. So this would be kind of in that R7 stage, the one picture that you're seeing. And a few miles away, in my area here, I got a field that's still at R6. And a lot of that is just due to moisture, because we've had more moisture in this area and the plants are staying greener longer. The other thing to be aware of this year, and we're seeing it a little bit more in the drier regions, is that any areas where there's some excess salt issues, that seems to be affecting the maturity as well and speeding things up. So in any transition areas of the field, so that area between the low and the high parts of the field, you'll start to see plants start to really shut down. So for the most part, I think we're, you know, for some of the earlier varieties, you're going to start to see, and especially if they're planted earlier, you're going to see some normal maturity, but just things sped up just a little bit because of the drier conditions. So nothing to be too terribly concerned with, but you will probably see a little bit lower yield potential in those fields that are maturing earlier.
So the other question he asked was, he was sowing an early maturing variety, and he was wondering if he should be looking at some of the later maturing varieties in the future. Any comments there?
I would probably, depending where you're at, like the one thing that's really, what I find is really good about producers in Manitoba over the years, is they've been able to find their niche when it comes to the varieties that they grow for the region. Now, given this year's conditions, things are a little drier, so things are going to mature a little quicker. but there's going to be years that we're still going to be pretty green by mid-August. So I would say still stick with your varieties that you've chosen for your region, because moisture you can't control, maturity you can't control, but you can control what varieties you plant. And planting something that's suited for your area, more often than not, will give you the best yield potential. The reason I look at all the yields from the different regions in the fall, and the one thing I've noticed between the we'll say the eastern and western regions is the yield potential, or the actual yield that farmers are getting when you look at all the numbers, are usually within 2 or 3 bushels of each other. Either way, some varieties, sometimes it's a little higher in the west, and sometimes a little higher in the east. The only time we're seeing a more of an extreme is when we get either extreme dry conditions. So if we're drier in the like in 2021, the western region was actually almost 7 bushels per acre higher than it was in the eastern region, because eastern was quite a bit drier. So stick with what you got, stick with the maturities. Even though things are shortening up this year, that's not going to be the same every year. And I'd rather go with something earlier than end up with frozen beans. So that's my thoughts on that.
Okay, and then the question has come in is with this early ripening, is it going to affect the quality of seed in some of the pods?
You'll probably see smaller seed in some instances that ran out of moisture. That's usually what we see. A lot of times those top pods don't get filled when you have dry conditions. So a few comments I've heard from growers over the last couple of weeks is that they went out to the field and they saw a lot of small pods that are laying on the ground. So those pods just didn't have enough moisture to fill. So right now, a rain would probably help to some degree, get a little bit bigger seed size. But in the drier regions, I would expect seed to be smaller. I don't foresee any problems with green seed or anything else like that at this point. But just smaller seed is on some of those fields.
Okay, and just one other question that I've been starting to get is, and you're the guy with the experience, a lot of the beans are really close to the ground right now on some of the fields I've been in. And the producers, any hints as to how to set that header to try to get the best pickup you can?
Well, the biggest thing I think, if you're dealing with a short stand of soybeans, probably the one thing you can really do if you have access to a flex header with an aerial. The aerial, what it does is it allows the beans it keeps the knife clean. And in years when the plants are short, a lot of times the misses come from the point of the beans getting cut, but they lay on the knife and then they start pushing. So if you have an aerial to keep that clean, that's going to aid a little bit in your harvest. The other thing you can do is the feeder house adjustment. A lot of combines have the ability to adjust your feeder house so that you can actually tip your knife down a little bit more, so you get a little bit lower. And the third thing, that this came back from a few years ago that somebody had tried, that they tried all this and it wasn't working. Check your rear axles and see if you can make an adjustment there on your combine, because if you can actually adjust your rear axle so that combine sits a little higher in the back, it sits a little lower in the front, that seems to be a few things you can try to do. But the biggest thing right now is if you had roll during the season, that's going to make things or early on, or during in season, that's going to make harvesting a little bit easier. But the biggest thing is, I think, just using the use of an aerial to keep the beans off the knife will make a big difference in getting more beans in the tank. So,
and one producer was asking, should he be looking at taking them off tougher than normal, just because he was, I guess, hoping they would stay in the pod until they get into the combine?
No, the biggest thing to be concerned with, I guess, with the early maturing varieties, and we do see this from time to time, with the early season varieties, wait till they're mature, but when they're mature, you go in and harvest. You don't wait until, you don't leave them out there any longer than you need to. The reason I say this is on years when we have mature plants on the early season varieties, and then we go through a period of wetting and drying, 5 or 6 times. And wetting and drying can either be from, getting a rainfall on mature crop, or just heavy dews in the morning. And then during the day, you're getting very hot, windy, dry conditions. What can happen is on those early maturing varieties, sometimes you'll start to see the pods start to twist and snap open. So on the year when the crop matures early, make sure you're in there harvesting when the beans are ready. Not all varieties are like that, but there are some varieties that we've seen over the years that are a little bit more prone to that. The problem is trying to put a plant that's not mature through the combine doesn't really work real well because a lot of the pods go at the back. So I wait till it's mature, wait till it's dry, and then get it off. And, if you can go in that 14-15% moisture, that's perfect. But I wouldn't, the plants still have to be mature enough to put through the combine because soybeans don't, when the straw is, we'll call it chewy, it doesn't really work well to thrash.
Okay, great, Dennis. Thanks for that information.
No problem.
Question for Anne regarding this producer was concerned about his wheat. We had some windy days there, and he was out there combining, and he was seeing a lot of his heads that were looking like this, and he was wanting to know, is this a common thing or is it variety specific? And I think he was just wanting to know some more information. And Anna was wondering if you maybe can make some comments if you've seen something like this happening, or is it something common for the year, or is it maybe a variety thing?
I have seen wheat that looks like this, this year and in previous years. I'm guessing that some varieties are more susceptible than others, or some varieties would be more susceptible than others, but I can say, like, just walking, say, the Macbeth plots where we look at a lot of different varieties every year, I haven't noticed anything being really variety specific that like comes to mind. So I'm thinking it's probably a combination of both the variety and the environmental conditions this year. So having some of those windy days really do a number on wheat, especially when it's open like this and the glooms have fallen off. So I don't have much more information other than it isn't uncommon to see wheat like this, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is with this year, I think too, we had a lot of different stages of maturity in the field. And I think wherever there was moisture, the crop is hanging on, and wherever there is, I guess, where it's droughted out, I guess, the crop is maybe a little bit overripe already. So I can see where it's maybe not just a variety thing, it's an environment thing.
Yeah, it's definitely like a factor of being overripe, and it's been a tough year for cereals where we do see some pretty patchy fields where, we're just having wheat or oats or barley in the field a lot longer. Some of those mature areas are in the field a lot longer than we'd like to see them in the field for. And last week was rough with those few really windy days. I know there was a lot of shelling out of all cereal crops in the field, especially in those thinner plant stands where they have more room to kind of move around and bang up against each other.
Yeah, and that was a good comment that you brought up about oats too. I was talking to several producers that were seeing the same thing, where oats was starting to shell out just because of the wind, and that's probably more common than any of the other crops when you get strong winds in oats.
Yeah, I think so.
Great, thanks, Ann. I did get a question from some producer regarding with the early harvest this year. He says, what should I be looking at for soil sampling? I think we're going to see, because of the conditions, we might be getting, some of our guys wanting to get soil sampling done faster or get out into the field faster. And I think Marla is away today, so was able to find this out. This is a comment actually from John Hurd, and it was basically saying that we can do soil testing quite late into the fall, and it's best done once the soil has cooled to 10 degrees Celsius or lower. At that temperature, any bacterial activity and or mineralization are at a minimum, and the status of the soil is best understood. So even though we'll be getting some crop off in August and early September here, I think soil moisture or soil temperature is something to watch for. The other thing John did mention in his comments was that you should take the temperature down to where you'll be putting your fertilizer, making sure that if you're going to be deep banding to 4 inches, make sure that the temperature down at 4 inches is cool to 10 degrees Celsius. This way you'll be getting an accurate temperature of where you're going to be applying your fertilizer as well. So just a comment regarding that. I think as we get more harvest done here, we're going to see more soil sampling being done, and just to keep an heads up on soil temperatures and making sure we have the right conditions to get a good sample. A little bit of a crop update right now, looking at harvest completion for the province, and varying quite a bit in some areas, but when you look at field peas, I think that's pretty consistent throughout. Most of the peas are 3/4 done right now. Their quality is actually really good, and from what I've been hearing, yields are good. We've been getting some oats being taken off. Again, the amount of acres right now is fairly low. So, but one thing I did hear is the test weights are fairly good, which is has surprised me a little bit. I was thinking the test weights were going to be down just because of the drier conditions, but right now I've been hearing anywhere from 41 to 43 pound oats. So that's good for producers. Barley, my travels, not a lot has been taken off yet, so I haven't seen a whole bunch of samples of barley, but I think in some of the regions there's been some taken off, and I've been hearing that the yields are about average, I think, so far, and test weights were good. Hopefully we don't get too much rain on it. I think it's one of the crops that kind of came in pretty quick here and was ready to go, but I think producers were, whether they were still finishing off their peas or were starting into their wheat already, and maybe the barley kind of took a back seat. But and spring wheat, early yields, again, something that surprised me. I've seen some pretty good yields coming off on some of the early fields, and quality really good with really good protein right now. So and I think that's something that's looks promising right now anyways. And spring wheat quality, I think really hasn't changed over the last 2 weeks here. And actually, a question just came in. Anne, are you still on? The question was regarding the conditions we've been having over the last couple of days here, where it's been foggy and misty rain. How quickly will our quality be affected by these kind of conditions?
Yeah, I definitely see some like staining on the wheat, and I'd be a little bit concerned about falling numbers, having wheat sitting in the field for a long time, and just general downgrading. If your wheat's mature, it can happen pretty quick. I don't know about like a specific timeline, but having well mature wheat sitting in the field with these rainy, misty conditions will likely result in some downgrading.
Okay, and I just one of the things you mentioned just there is falling number. So falling number important in wheat as well?
Yeah, definitely important in wheat, and it has a big impact on baking quality. So that's why it's such a big, because when you're mixing flour with water, you're wanting some sort of like enzyme activation for baking. So it's very important for quality of flour for any sort of baking. So that's kind of why people have put an emphasis on it recently, is just paying more attention to how the wheat actually performs. And I'm not sure how much that's being tested in terms of like an elevator, but they're using some sort of other metrics in terms of appearance as well, or they can be using some of those to be downgrading.
Okay, thanks, Anne. And just one more thing regarding I guess crop/weather update. This is the system that was down in the States, and they say is going to be hitting Saskatchewan and Manitoba here over the next little while. And this comes from Weather Logistics, and it's saying usually they would hit one of the coasts before it would hit us, but it's kind of strange for it to be coming up to our way. So this is what they had for today. So it's looking like we could be in for some wet conditions for today, and I think we're kind of seeing that right now. Just haven't been getting a lot of the heavy rain. I've been hearing that some places in Saskatchewan have been getting some heavier rain, but not yet in Manitoba here, but maybe later on today. just a few more slides before we end today. Crop residue burning program is on, so definitely check the website to see if you're in a residue, if you can burn. Actually, you just had a question come in. I guess that'd be more for Dennis and Ann. Are late season rains helping the soybeans and the corn?
I'll jump in on that one right now on the soybean side. The soybeans are right now. The rains will help with seed fill. They won't really help with yield anymore. I think the yield has potential has kind of been set already. So it's going to help mostly with seed size, unless, yeah, no, it was just mostly for seed size at this point in time, because usually rainfall is more critical when you're in that R5, early R5 stage, just because that's when the seed is filling. And right now we're into R6, R7. So
yeah, be a similar story for the corn. So we're seeing a range of corn maturities ranging from like an R3 to a R5, R6. So yeah, with the less mature corn, we're definitely would see more of an impact of those rains helping with seed fill.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, that we're probably pleated to the stage now where it'll help in seed fill, but probably not increase yield overall. So good. Thanks, guys. Okay, our hay listing service. So if you're got hay for sale or looking to buy feed, go to our hay listing service. There's the 2 phone numbers there. If you've got hay for sale, call one of those numbers and people there will help you get your information on the hay listing service and get it on there accurately for you. So definitely call those numbers if you're looking for hay to sell or straw to sell. And if you're looking to buy feed, just go to the website and you'll be able to get the information off there. Our crop extension specialist, as I've been mentioning over the last couple of weeks, we've been out in the field a fair bit doing disease surveys. I think a lot of us are into the canola disease surveys right now and finding different things out in the field. So if you're got any questions, give any one of these people a call and they can definitely give you a hand figuring things out, what's happening in the field. Our livestock people, again, we're getting into that time of season where producers are starting to take inventory of their feed. So if you got questions regarding extending feed, adding different things to your ration, give these people a call. They can definitely help you with rations and extending your grazing season. The MASC service center numbers, there's the office numbers. So if you got questions, and again, we're getting into that time of year where we're going to be into harvest. And if you think you might be in a situation where you need one of the people to come out and take a look at stuff, it's definitely best to call first before you do anything. And mine and Lori's contact information. So if you've got any questions, please give us a call. And if the rains slow down here, we'll probably be back in the fields harvesting over the next few days here. So by next week, we should be, getting that number down up to about 25 to 40% complete, hopefully, if we get the right kind of weather. So thanks for attending. Thanks, Ann, for the update on winter wheat and fall rye. And see everybody next week, August the 30th.